All right, welcome everybody to episode number 3 of Elevate Your Grind, brought to you by Cannabis Lab. Hope you guys enjoyed our first 2.5 episodes. We had Robert Freeman, we had Brady Cobb, we had Andrew Felix. Great group of people, and realistically, folks, all we're doing is going through the leadership of the Cannabis Lab board. I am joined by Ari Gerstin of Ackerman. Ari, you were on the Dade County board?
Yes, I'm on the Dade County board of Cannabis Lab. I've been on the board now for 2 years.
Awesome.
And last year I was the educational director. This year I'm just a board member.
Very cool. So I sit on the Broward board, you're on the Dade board. I don't love going to your meetings because of how far they are, but
Feel the same.
I think it's a great group of people. So Ari, today I want to get a little bit into your story, into the Ackerman story. I don't hold my opinions back on this show, mainly because they're not that strong. I know a lot of great cannabis lawyers in this space, and there's a lot of good firms that are focusing on it. Personally, I've had the best relationship with Ackerman. You, Zach, John, you guys have all been super friendly. Wealth is a wealth of knowledge. You know, I know Michael Schwam from Dwayne Morris. We know Jerry Greenspoon, who's a big supporter of Cannabis Lab as well. But you guys really just seem to have not just one or two rock stars, but a solid team of people focused on this industry. I even met two of your lawyers out on your West Coast office that came to a San Diego event that I had hosted. Amazing people as well. So talk to me. We'll get to Ackerman in a second, but talk to me about you. You know,
Sure.
Obviously you grew up. Did you always want to be a lawyer? What attracted you to law to begin with?
Sure, certainly. Definitely did not always want to be a lawyer, and thank you for the compliments. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Definitely did not always want to be a lawyer. Definitely did not ever want to do cannabis law. Had no interest, had no inkling that I would ever end up doing anything like this until actually within the last, I guess, 5 to 10 years. You know, situations happened in my career. I've been practicing for about 15 years now, and unfortunately, about 10 years into my practice, one of my closest colleagues committed suicide.
Ooh.
And I ended up transitioning my career, and that was right about the time when Florida was starting with medical marijuana back in 2013, 2014, 2015. And, you know, it was really exploding here. So it was something where I was like, wow, this is really interested. People are really invigorated, really interested. Seems like a great state to do it. You know, the Sunshine State, we're very agriculture here. Embraced it and just kind of try to learn as much as I could about what was going on, what was happening. Unfortunately, things have been going a little bit slow. Mm-hmm. We haven't made much progress in Florida since that time. We have some licenses have been given out and such, but otherwise, you know, it's largely the same people that applied then are now in business. So anyway, that little development there is what kind of drew me into the industry. And then when I saw what was happening, I guess, in Florida, the rollout has been so slow, kind of maybe even more interested in this industry and really fighting for expansion of it, because I saw in the limited view of what we have here, just the amount of help that it was helping those people who could get access to it, that this just needed to be more available to others.
Sure.
And it really motivated me to get more involved and to fight to really try to open it up to others.
I think that's great. So, you know, obviously you couldn't have just studied to be a cannabis lawyer.
Exactly.
I mean, I know you went to the University of Miami, so things might be a little bit different there. I was originally going to ask Zach Corbin to interview, but he chose to present at UF, and so I wrote him off completely. Now, I'm hesitant to sit down with someone from the University of Miami. Obviously, with my Brady interview, I went to Florida State. But what type of law did you study that really led you, or what were you practicing before that led you to natively get into the cannabis side of things? I'm assuming something to do with government. And folks, I'm not a legal expert, so if I don't use the right terms, well, you're probably not a legal expert either. So go on.
Well, I did actually. I studied litigation and business law,
Okay.
And I also did some white collar defense. So that really helped me get an appreciation for what happens in the criminal system and what it's like to be a criminal defendant.
Sure.
To see what it's like for someone to go through that system is really eye opening. And when I saw that this, you know, marijuana is illegal, I was not a marijuana user. Seeing what people go through to use this product really is shocking, mm-hmm. because it's not harmful to a lot of people. I mean, of course, children shouldn't use it, and people who don't have medical conditions shouldn't use it unless it's legal in their state. But otherwise, it's not a harmful substance like a heroin or a cocaine where you can overdose and die.
Or alcohol, really, for that matter, which is
exactly.
perfectly legal.
So, you know, it's something where it was something that just motivated me to really want to get involved in it and really learn more about it, because when you start digging into it, you realize that it's been used throughout history. I mean, really since almost the beginning of time, people have been talking about cannabis and how they use cannabis in all kinds of different ceremonies and legal proceedings and all for all kinds of purposes.
Yeah, it's funny, I watch a lot of Joe Rogan, and I hope this doesn't take us on too much of a tangent, but, they're saying a lot of the miracles and things that happen in religious texts were actually drug use, right? And not in a bad way, like, oh, that person was high and they had a vision, but that people get, and this is maybe getting way too spiritual for this podcast, but that these things were put on our planet for that connection to a higher power. So there's a lot of angles there, and let's not go down that rabbit hole, but you just brought that up. So you mentioned Florida a lot, and I definitely want to go through all the things that you've done in Florida, but within Ackerman, do you focus just on the state of Florida, or do you practice outside of Florida as well?
Definitely outside of Florida.
Okay.
A lot of my focus has been on Florida because there's been a lot of activity here, but certainly I've done litigation outside of Florida. We have a lot of transactions that are outside of Florida. We're across the country now. We have 700 lawyers and 22 offices. Wow. So we have folks everywhere.
How big is the cannabis team?
The cannabis team is probably about 25 lawyers, I believe. Yeah, and obviously we have offices out in the West Coast, like in LA. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a different world over there now. We have an office in Denver as well. It's very different over there, but we're all part of the same team. And their insight on a mature market is very helpful because they have insight about things that are not at all regulated here or even addressed under our law that help us understand how we might be able to make things work under Florida law that aren't addressed.
So Florida is we're slow and steady here,
Steady.
Yeah. I said this at the Thursday night Broward meeting, and I said 10 years ago, if you wanted to do it legally, you had to go to Amsterdam. 5 years ago, we were going pretty much to Denver, and just the other day, I walked into a dispensary here in Florida and was able to get marijuana 100% legally. So I love the fact that we can do that, but there's only 14 operating companies that are providing it right now. So we're about to get into Florida, but just leading into that, is there a market that you think is kind of or should be the de facto model for states adopting medical marijuana? Because California has been legal for a very long time. They keep increasing taxes. They seem to have a problem with licensing, and they still have a pretty thriving black market. I've heard very positive things about Colorado, but when you look at the grand cannabis economy, if you will, a lot of the guys who are out front are failing now, and they've run out of money. I mean, today, MedMen's CEO is stepping down, and I mean, that's just the last event to happen in a trail of bad events from who's probably one of the market leaders in getting out there. I mean, I first learned about MedMen listening to him on the Howard Stern show. So do you see a market out there that it should, at least for now, be modeled after?
I mean, I think Colorado's a very good example for everyone to follow. I mean, they did a very slow and steady approach. They weren't as open as an Oregon or a Washington. They didn't grow nearly as quickly, but they are very innovative. They only recently allowed out-of-state companies to invest and to own, businesses there. They started out with vertical integration. They've learned from their mistakes, and they've taken the opportunity to be innovative. Whereas a state like Florida kind of looks at everybody and says, well, we don't really like to do anything, and we want to just try everything on our own. And while at the same time pointing to California and saying, well, look what they did over there. Unfortunately with California, it's two extremes. You had basically a medical program that was just had no principles. I mean, it was almost wide open, and now you have a very tough regulatory system for recreational, which they're trying, but it's just too onerous, and there's too many people that are falling outside the system. It's very expensive. The medical program was so large that there's just people falling outside that just don't want to shut down operations and try to enter into this very expensive recreational market when they can't really compete. The prices are just so artificially high because of all the compliance costs and whatnot.
Yeah, and personally, when I look at the California recreational market, listen, as somebody who enjoys this product, I mean, the what they're putting out there is incredible. But when you go into a California dispensary and you are truly looking for medication, or you're looking for a nutraceutical, if you will, if you truly want to use this as the legalization process is intending, you're not getting that type of advice. You're getting, what do you think of this versus that? Oh, well, this one has more THC, so you want to buy that. Mm-hmm. When realistically, even someone like myself who enjoys using flower the way that it's been used forever, look at some of the lower percentages just because I don't always want Everclear. Let's put it that way. Sometimes I want a beer, right? So do you think that thriving recreational market kind of brings that stigma back around and puts that back on the cannabis industry because it's overshadowing completely the medical market?
Well, I think you raised some very important issues there, because there's several issues packed in there that I think are very valid. And one of them is really shortages also, is that, when markets are gearing up to become recreational, sometimes the medical is kind of left on the sidelines. Like, oh, we're not going to really invest into medical products. We're not going to invest into serving medical patients. We want the recreational customer because it's unlimited, basically. We don't need to get one of 10,000 or one of 100,000 patients. We can get anyone who walks in the door. But that becomes a problem. There become shortages. I mean, this is a product that grows in nature, that requires manufacturing, that requires cultivation. So it's not just unlimited supply. So that becomes an issue with shortages. Also, there is a big disconnect with knowledge, being that it is somewhat of a gray area in every state. We don't have a pharmacist. We have a bud tender.
Yeah.
And the levels of education there are vary greatly, if any. And a lot of times it's just really based on, personal experience, which might not be at all like the person that they're recommending to. And that can become something that's very dangerous when you have a vulnerable population, like someone who's in need of this medication for a debilitating condition. So I think that's a very important concern when people think about recreational, is that going to be a substitute for a medical regime? Are we going to create a more formal medical regime? Or are we just going to, blend everything into one? So I think those are all considerations that people have to take into account. And that's one of the concerns that I have with the ballot measure that was slated. People refer to it as the Milf measure, because all it was in Florida, which was going to basically, it's a very simple measure. It was going to be on the Constitution, but they didn't have enough signatures this time around. Basically, it was just going to change our law so that anyone who was over 21 could walk into a medical marijuana treatment center instead of having a card.
Yeah.
So there was no real separation between recreational or medical. But I mean, you're competing with people going to the Super Bowl, trying to get products.
Yeah.
There's things like that. And here in Florida, with the vertical integration that we have right now, there is a supply constraint. There is not enough product to go around. It's difficult for patients to get a consistent supply of what they might want specifically, and a lot of times people are forced to choose alternatives.
No, and I fully agree with that. So after I make this statement, I want to get into the Florida kind of history, so this way people can understand it more, because you had talked about the Milf, and how they didn't see that is beyond me. There's nobody in that boardroom that just said, hey guys, maybe not the best acronym, but it is Make It Legal Florida, and it is an acronym which is MILF, and I don't know if that was intentional or not.
I haven't seen that in any of the official advertisements.
Yeah. So there is a shortage. There's a shortage of strain. There's a shortage of flower in general. So, until recently, until they passed smokable flower, somebody who used cannabis would go into a dispensary and see a ton of products that they don't recognize, that they never use, they're not familiar with. And that truly, to me, there needed to be a huge education on it. I have a history of cannabis. It is not very long, but I had never seen a syringe with oil in it, or a topical cream, or anything else like that. But if a patient here in Florida goes and finds a dispensary and they find a strain that works perfectly for them, there is no guarantee that the next time they need to re-up that particular strain is going to be there, or in a quantity that they need to buy. So then they're deferred to buy, oh, well, this is similar to that, or this is similar to that. But going back to your point, with genetics and strains, everything affects people differently.
Very differently. It's incredibly different. That's a huge problem. And it's not as bad as it was before, because previously this would happen and people would have driven 2.5 hours to get to the one dispensary that was somewhat remotely nearby. Yeah. Now there's more dispensaries around. There's still a lack of products, but at least they're not driving, maybe they're driving a half hour, but they're not driving 2.5 hours to get, to the Trulieve by the airport, to find out that unfortunately today this is all we have.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem, because one of the problems with cannabis legalization is that, it's a catch-22. You can't get the research, without it being legal. They don't want to legalize it until they have the research. Yep. So we've been in this problem now for years. It's like, one thing has to go forward. Unfortunately, it seems like we're going to be legalizing without having all of the research together. The bright side of it is that with this substance, we know that it's been used by millions upon millions of people since the beginning of time. So people haven't been dropping like flies during that time period. This isn't something that you can overdose on. While obviously you don't want to harm yourself, it's not something like heroin where you can just inject yourself and die on the side of the road. So luckily we have that, but there isn't the science that we'd like to have for medicine. And when you're forcing patients to make these choices or to choose alternatives based on a bud tender's recommendation, it's not ideal.
Yeah, and I agree with that. So from the medical standpoint, the research would be incredible because, someone like me, I'm a user. I started around 22 or 23, right? After I had found my work ethic, after I had started working and I found a little bit of success and used it as a disconnect at the end of the day. So, a lot of people say they don't use it growing up, don't use it while your brain's in the development mode and everything else. So I have, and everybody who gave me crap, it is a 3-month-old daughter, not a 3-year-old daughter. Mom, Dad, Laura, I'm sorry that I got that wrong. Mackenzie, when you grow up and we let you watch this, yes, you're a lot younger than I made you out to be. But, this is a conversation because of me being in this industry that I'm going to have with her. And, I spoke to two people that you work with, and I won't call them out by name because I don't want anybody knowing. But they were saying that my kids do this and I have to hide it because of that stigma and everything else. So, I know as a parent, it's my responsibility to have that conversation with my kid, but we don't have the information as parents except for our own our own experiences to have that conversation to say, hey, when you're 14, 15, yes, I understand mom and dad do this, but maybe you shouldn't do it yet because your brain's still developing, and have the research why to have that educated conversation. So,
but it's very similar to alcohol. I mean, I think it's a very similar conversation, whereas people will see their parents drinking alcohol, and we all know that kids shouldn't be drinking alcohol. It might not have the same effects on brain development, but there are other negative impacts that are just as bad, and it could lead to addiction. So it's a very similar conversation that one would have. It's just it's an adult choice. I mean, now even cigarettes, as I understand it, are 21 and older, which is amazing. I mean, that kind of happened just like overnight without any real fanfare. But now you go into CVS and there's like a sign there, hey, you have to be 21, which is pretty amazing to me. I don't know what people did overnight when they're just like. In college students, I remember in college there would be a whole crowd of people outside of the dorm the first year of college. That would be a whole crew. I don't know what those people would do. That one night they flip the switch and suddenly they can't buy cigarettes anymore. It's like no one would have thought you needed a fake ID in college to get cigarettes.
No, and that's crazy. The only thing you do at 18 now is go to war. So
right.
So I want to get into Florida's medical marijuana. So we have a very big state. As I understand it, we're probably the second largest medical market in the country. And we have 22 licenses. Of those 22, 14 of those companies are operating. I believe the 15th is Acreage, but they don't have flower. They still need to grow it, so they can't open their doors yet.
They now have a store.
They do.
They
so
do
the
have a store. Okay. Yes, they just last week they opened up their store.
Okay.
The Botanist.
Yeah, the Botanist, Acreage. Milf is a pioneer in the cannabis industry. A great guy. I've had calls with him. So congratulations to Acreage for coming into Florida, being number 15. I really wish you were number like 215, but we'll get there eventually. So we go no medical cannabis. There's a vote, was it 2016, 17?
November 2016.
2016, and then all of a sudden medical cannabis is now legal. They have to implement the program, but flower is off the table. There's only extracts. So how did that work? How was that legislation? Were you guys a part of that yet? Because I know you're very instrumental in shaping a lot of the laws in Florida.
So when the amendment came to pass, right before that, Florida had loosened the law slightly to allow people who had 2 doctors saying that they had 1 year to live. Those people could get cannabis, like full-strength cannabis. Prior to that, it was only people who had epilepsy and some very limited conditions they could get that low THC cannabis. Mm-hmm. But then, I guess, right before the amendment passed, they loosened it up. They passed what's called the Right to Try Act that allowed people with terminal conditions to get medical cannabis, kind of allowed the MMTCs to start planning, the full-octane cannabis. Still no flower. And then when the amendment passed, they were preparing for the amendment to pass throughout 2016. Mm-hmm. Then when it passed, they kind of stuttered a little bit to figure out like what we're going to do to really implement this. Is it just changing what we already have? Is it a whole new regime? Unfortunately, they settled upon interpreting it to be basically just a slight change to what we already have. And that kind of handicapped the program slightly. The Florida legislature decided that they were going to put all these limitations on the program. They decided that they weren't going to allow smoking. They made that permanent in the program. I'm not really sure where they got the basis for doing that. We were involved in litigating for one of the licenses of one of the original people who applied.
So how many licenses were originally issued? Because I remember it being a very, very small quantity.
It was supposed to be 5.
5.
And then it was
5
6.
in the entire state of Florida.
Right. It was supposed to be 5, and it was supposed to be 5 regions of Florida. Now, the state was divided up into regions, but these organizations didn't actually have to service these regions. So it was kind of nonsensical. It really made no sense. But yes, there were 5, and you had to apply to a certain region, and that's how they scored them. And then it became a whole debacle. There was all kinds of problems. Yada, yada, yada. I think it was 28 applicants total. And the licensees that we have now, the 22, those are all of the people whose applications were actually scored in that process. All those people who got their applications scored, first to last, all have licenses now.
Okay.
And that's it. No one else has any licenses. They haven't accepted any applications. It's only those people. Throughout the past 3 years, they've gradually made settlements which enabled those people to get their licenses in different stages. So it was 5, then 6, and then it was, I think, 13, and then 22.
Wow. So we have 22 in the entire state of Florida,
but they each get 35 stores. Now.
35. Well, each except for one of them. Yeah. So, but they're able to get more stores as we have more patients come online. Correct?
They're able to get more. Okay. So it started out 25, and then it went to 30, and then it went to 35. Now it's at 40, I believe, actually, because we just crossed the threshold. But April 2020, that provision goes away, so they'll all be able to get unlimited.
Okay. Which is a great, I mean, it's a great advantage for the first 14 companies to really have a foothold in this industry. But again, we have 14 companies in the entire state, and Florida is a giant state. In California, I'm guessing there's tens of thousands of companies. It is not vertically integrated. And I think you and I had this conversation the Thursday night in Wynwood, saying that, the 14, they have their lead. They're out in front. They've established their dispensaries. They've established their business models. And they are some really, really rock star CEOs. Brady, Kim, the CEOs of these companies are incredible. And I'm sure they can look at their supply chain and say, if we can cut that business and outsource it, we can really make some more money. So how do you think that the 14 feel about it right now? And then how do we feel about, and I can't do math, the other 8 that have not built out their businesses yet? Do you think that the 14 are ready to break up vertical integration? Do you think they're kind of on the fence? I know those 8 are probably completely against it right now.
I would probably think that those 8 are the most against it out of any, because they're the newly licensed ones, and a lot of them haven't really had a chance to really fully set up. The problem is that the investment is huge. It's while the first movers have this advantage, it's very costly. It's incredibly costly. I mean, they have a lock on the market, but they have to set up a cultivation site, they have to set up processing, and they have to set up all these stores. And that's huge in terms of investment. There's no banks that are going to lend any money to these people. There's no mortgages. So you're talking about a cash business with private investors financing. And, it's a gray area in terms of federal law. So you have a lot of risk. So even though these people have basically what we've called a golden ticket and it being a cartel or a super license, it's not as easy as one would think. So there's a tension between wow, I've got the monopoly, and wow, I could do so much more if I could just avoid having to deal with this aspect of it, because that's not what I do. That's not why I got into the business. I didn't sign up to be a cultivator.
So what were the costs of those first initial state granted licenses? Because I doubt they're anywhere close to where they are now.
The application fee was approximately $70,000.
So $70,000, which by no means is cheap, and I'm sure attorney's fees and everything else we can probably call it 100, 120. You guys are really good, so maybe more. But today, people are paying, and I'm going to completely generalize because I don't want to call anyone out, $40 to $60 million just for the license. And then, as you said, I think the number one company in Florida has 42 to 45 dispensaries already. So you're starting out in a $40 to $60 million hole without even operating, just to say, okay, now you can operate. And then, as you said, you have to no mortgages. And that's something that I just learned just now. I realized that you couldn't get institutional financing. I realized that you couldn't get loans or banking or anything else, but just something as simple as a mortgage on a building, not to be able to access that. So really,
or rent it a space. that has a mortgage on it. So, you can't even go into a building where the owner of that building has a mortgage on that, because that owner won't be able to give you a lease there.
So realistically, if you think about it right now, for those remaining 8 companies, it's all Florida is really doing is opening the doors for only people like Acreage or Canopy or someone who has millions of dollars in the bank, which candidly is drying up, to be able to enter this space to compete. Are they even going to continue to enter Florida right now with the high barrier to entry, given that cash is so tight in the overall cannabis market?
Well, that definitely remains to be seen. I mean, of those 8, several of them have cultivation authorization. I believe all except for one, but none of them have processing or dispensing authorization. So, that remains to be seen what ends up happening with those licenses, if those people hold on to them or if they change hands again. At this point, some people are just holding on to them basically and going through the motions, hoping that they could flip them to somebody else. Because, an out-of-state operator, there are a lot of them here already, but there are some others that aren't. Those people have experience. They could presumably come in, have lower startup costs. They have more experience, but still, it's a huge capital-intensive investment to get started, to get rolling, to get just product on the shelves.
Sure. So going back to it, so Florida is a completely vertically integrated state, and when we say vertically,
even delivery.
So it's
delivery. Like everything you could possibly think of, and some people forget about that. Just every possible thing, even the minor things like a delivery, is just. You have to do it.
Yeah. So we have to take here in Florida, we have to take all the way from putting the seed into the ground to putting the end product in the customer's hand, whether it's delivery, whether it's retail. I think those are the only 2 methods. But it has to be tracked the whole way. So you have to have a cultivation company, you have to have a processing company, you have a logistic company, you have to have a retail company.
You have to be that company.
And yes, so you have to manage all these businesses. Now, there are people, like you said, the ones that are operating out of state that come in that can kind of set that up. So that's what we're doing here in Florida. And as I understand it, I met with one of your colleagues earlier this year in March, and, they were all excited because you guys had basically won a case that said vertical integration was unconstitutional, right?
Yes.
This was in March. We are now in January of the following year, and everything is still vertically integrated. So, this is my knowledge of the law. You guys won. I thought, hey, we're going to start seeing the breakup of vertical integration. Maybe I should start reaching out to some of my friends that have farmland and let's get into this licensing game. But we're still not there. So
yes. Talk
to me about why, not even why you won. You guys won, and then why aren't we seeing that? So what still has to happen to get there?
So it's it's unfortunate what has happened. Like you say, we did prevail. We were successful. We were also very optimistic when we were getting a new governor that he was going to put some pressure on his administrative agencies to kind of have a different interpretation of the Constitution than the former Department of Health had. Unfortunately, that didn't help either. So we've been in litigation now this whole time. We've prevailed at the Circuit Court, we prevailed at the Appellate Court, and now we're at the Supreme Court. So it just has taken this amount of time to wind through the courts. Every time we've won, the Department of Health and the state have appealed.
Okay.
And that's just the normal legal process. This is a high-stakes case. It's going to have an impact statewide, so the Florida Supreme Court agreed to actually take the case. They don't take a lot of cases. We're actually very lucky that they decided to take the case because we're going to get some conclusion so very soon. The state's brief is due to be filed February 5th, which is next week.
Okay.
At that point, it's going to be in the hands of the Florida Supreme Court. Hopefully we'll get a ruling on this issue. We can move forward after that. But as of now, every court that's looked at it has said that vertical integration is not permissible. And of course, there's not any other industry that I can think of where there's complete vertical integration. I can't think of anything or any other product that must be made that way.
Unless it's by choice. Unless it's, we're a successful company, so we decided to vertically integrate to lower our margins.
But that would be illegal in some industries. That's not even legal because that's antitrust.
Yeah.
So here we have this forced vertical integration. Now, we're not against vertical integration per se. We're not trying to abolish those licenses. So if they want to keep that as an optional type of license, then that's fine. We just think that there should also be other types of licenses for people who don't want to do complete vertical integration.
No, and I agree with you. And I'm going to give two completely Todd Rosales opinions here. If you look at two of the CEOs in the space, and only because I interviewed one, and I'm going to take his assumptions about the other, you look at Brady Cobb and Kim Rivers, right? Brady Cobb wants to have the top shelf Pappy Van Winkle type stuff. So for him, vertical integration makes sense because he can control every part of the supply chain. But I'm sure Kim Rivers, who has the most stores, who has probably some of the most products, who has brands already established within Trulieve, would love to be able to work with a bunch of different cultivators and brands and bring those under the Trulieve umbrella and just take that model of scale and repeatable. And I think there is space. There's a ton of space in this state alone for both of those models, right? I mean, we see it with liquor. We see it with cigarettes. We see, and I don't mean to just go for the sins there, but, we see it with a lot of products that there is space for everything. And it doesn't mean that one's better than the other. It's just, what do you prefer?
Sure. So, it's like a craft, it's like a craft model almost. There's definitely a need for a craft brand. Certainly a need for that. But also imagine if that craft brand were to fail. They would have a crop failure. That could happen. It's an agricultural commodity. So, if that crop were to fail, you have one of 22 of the only 22 licenses around that's going to fail. They might not be able to provide product. That could be disastrous to a market. That's not a good thing. And if it's forced vertical integration, it's very difficult to substitute with another product. I mean, there's provisions in Florida law where if there's a crop failure, you can make some arrangements, but it's very challenging. And it's not obviously something that people want to do. You have to provide all kinds of documentation and whatnot to substitute. And plus, we're also not thinking here in Florida, we don't have edibles yet. Yeah. We don't have every product. And a product like that, you don't necessarily want to be just made by one company. I mean, because it is a food, and there's different tastes there. There's different chefs you might want to have. So just having shirts that come in black, people might not want that. It's just people might want something else. They might want something with a little more kick to it or something else. Whereas the flavors at one of the MMTCs might just be boring.
No, and I think it's really cool. So we do only have 14, and the really cool thing about that is you do see a lot of support between the companies, right? I'm sure people think, oh, there are 14 Goliaths battling it out. No, I really think it is one of the greatest co-op petitions I've ever seen. I just this morning saw Kim Rivers tweet, and Kim, I guess I'm mentioning you a lot here, but she tweeted about Liberty Health Sciences and congratulating them on their earnings. And,
yeah, I saw they did very well.
A major CEO of a rival congratulating another company on their earnings. I mean, realistically, she sees Liberty and she just sees the entire Florida market coming up. And Brady said the exact same thing. So I think that is really cool. I would actually love to be a fly on the wall to have a CEO conference of those 14 sitting at the table and really hear their opinions. But I think
those are absolutely the most fascinating things actually that C-Lab does. At least once a year they have a conference, and that part of the conference when they have like a CEO roundtable, it's very insightful. I mean, I've been going to it for years, and hearing them talk is really interesting to hear their perspectives because they are very unique. I mean, as the market started out, there was a little bit of competition or pointing fingers at one another. But like you say, that has all dissipated, and they don't do that anymore, and they do all get along. I don't know if it's mutual pain and suffering or what, but they do all seem to get along, and I don't know that they necessarily directly compete 100% against each other. They are targeted towards different populations, I guess, at this point.
And it's almost become like a fraternal organization of these CEOs and of these companies in the state of Florida, which is really cool in my opinion, which is part of the reason I love being in this industry, is everybody really wants to work together.
And let me say, we do challenge the Department of Health on a lot of things, but they are a very cooperative and hands-on regulator. And when, even though it could be said because there's only 22, but they are very accessible. So it isn't something where you're dealing with just like a black hole or an empty mailbox. I mean, you get responses from them. You get detailed responses. They'll give you insight.
That's cool.
And that is very helpful to have a regulator that's like that. So I do have to compliment them in that regard. I think that's great.
Very cool. So talk to me about this. So if you guys are successful in winning your case, vertical integration is unconstitutional. What does Cannabis 2.0 look like in Florida? Are we going to have different levels of licensing? Do we not know? Does it still need to be looked at? Should you guys win? And I think a lot of people are cheering for you. At C-Lab, we talk about that a lot of us would like to see the breakup of vertical integration. I talked to some of the chief compliance officers at some of the MMTCs, and they kind of, without saying so much, would say, yes, we would like to get rid of a few of our business units to streamline operations. What does that look like the day after? What does Cannabis 2.0 look like in Florida?
So the Department of Health was actually on this path. They were ready to start this sort of what we think would have been the correct regulatory process. They were going to have actual meetings to implement the Constitution. and they released a template of rules to go forward and implement Amendment 2. Unfortunately, what happened was that the legislature immediately stepped in. They called a special session, and they said, if you keep going forward with your rulemaking or your regulation-making process, then we're going to take your funding away. Instead, you have to go through this rulemaking process under our statute, which is basically a glass ceiling. You can't do a lot of the things that they wanted to do because the statute prohibits it. So there is a process set forth in place where the department basically has to solicit input from constituents, like a normal rulemaking process where they'll have workshops throughout the state, they'll make proposals, people will write in comments, like in a typical administrative rulemaking process, except there's no artificial ceiling of just improper regulation from the legislature. It's the amendment that we voted for allows the Department of Health to regulate with the input of the citizens. Instead, what we have is the legislature has imposed their will on the Department of Health, and whatever they say, the Department of Health has to interpret.
Yeah.
So instead of being from the top down, it's going to be from the bottom up. And hopefully, if the department goes forward with what it's supposed to do, they'll be setting workshops as to how to implement the provisions of the amendment, which are very broad and will take input from the public. And people, I'm sure, will be talking about how there should be small business, there might be, micro licenses and things like that, ability for people to have, craft cannabis, to share licenses, all kinds of different things. I envision, if we were to prevail, a real rebirth for small business, because that's really who's been left out of this. People who want to do delivery, people who want to do their own processing, people who have their own ideas about their own packaging and how they want to have their own stores. They want to offer, specific services to specific patients. There's so much that small businesses can do. They're just totally excluded.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, one of the things I love about cannabis that I've always thought, even before I got into it and before it was legal and everything else, is it's going to bring jobs back to this country, jobs back to the state. We are a heavy agricultural state, right? And those farming in this country in general is just not doing well, right? So, we can have a new tech startup come here, right? And whether it's, call it, super awesome technology company, but the chances are that company is going to go to a city and it's going to be a lot of white collar, highly educated jobs, coding and everything else. And yes, I know there are a lot of very successful coders that just skip college and everything else, but it is a very online tech centric world that we live in here, whereas something like cannabis is bringing back your straightforward manufacturing and blue collar jobs. It's bringing back truck driving, agriculture, manufacturing, factory work. I mean, these are jobs that have been historically disappearing out of this country that this one industry is bringing right back. So I see your point, and I couldn't agree with you more on that.
Yeah, and that's just the jobs that are directly connected. I mean, also you have the building jobs, you have the AC jobs, you have all kinds of support staff that's needed for these companies. I mean, you're opening up in rural areas that are going to need new roads and more transportation methods. I mean, there's so many things that are spun off from these businesses that we're just kind of leaving on the table. It's also inspired people to go back to school to learn about agriculture. People are actually inspired in learning about plants. For the last, 20, 30, 40 years, there hasn't been that much inspiration about learning about plants. But now, colleges are starting to create programs about cannabis and about hemp, how to grow them, the different types. It's a very fascinating plant with a lot of different varieties, and there's a lot to be learned. It's not as simple as just putting a seed in the ground. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot that can be learned, and there's a lot of professional and non-professional jobs that can come out of that.
I think that's awesome. And so you touched on something, and there's 100 more things that every time you talk I want to go into. But we are obviously filming this with a microphone and a cell phone, so we don't have unlimited time. But hemp, I think hemp, listen, there's a bazillion CBD companies out there. CBD, great. It's a great substance. I work with Ricky Williams' company and going into that herbal spot. But CBD is just one of many things we can do. So I had talked, and this is very funny, I talked about at Cannabis Lab, somebody please deliver me a hemp straw, because I am very sick, and in Palm Beach County and Broward County, they're mandating these paper straws that disintegrate in your drink. You can't finish your drink with it. The waiter's giving you 2 or 3. So yes, okay, we're saving the sea turtles, but now we're killing the trees. My colleague Dave Levy and I were online, and there was a company that provided a hemp straw. We bought a pack of them. They're actually in the Starbucks screen. I got to tell you, it's one of the greatest inventions I've ever seen in my life. And I can't wait to see what else hemp brings us. Do you have an idea of, how do we have that type of business in Florida right now? I know Texas is really looking at hempcrete and hemp fibers. Is Florida focused on that yet? I know our hemp industry is very young as well, too.
It's very young. We have a lot more to go as to hemp. Right now, we've got the rules out as to selling hemp, not yet as to seeds. All these rules are supposed to be finalized, I guess, by the end of, towards the end of January, I guess now February. So we're not there yet, but we're moving very, very fast. There's one issue with the hemp is that while we have this great new farm bill that kind of allows all this to develop and to grow, there's still a lot of stigma associated with hemp. There are still a lot of controls about manufacturing. There's a lot of controls about cultivation. So there's a lot of hoops that one has to go through to really manufacture and to cultivate. It's not as simple as growing tomatoes.
Yeah.
And perhaps it should be at least a little bit more simple for people.
It's regulated almost like the THC side of cannabis.
It's regulated incredibly tough. And some states are very strict as to what happens if you have a hot plant that tests above the threshold of THC. You have to destroy it, and that could be disastrous for people. All of a sudden you have a crop because scientifically there's no difference between the plants. I mean, it's hemp and hemp and marijuana are legal terms. The plant itself is all cannabis sativa. It's the criteria is the amount of THC, which isn't a defining characteristic until you actually harvest the plant. So it's a real issue for farmers because there's a good likelihood that you'll have a hot plant. I mean, you're looking at a low threshold, and it's not a scientific procedure. I mean, it's a matter of you've taken genetics which you think are going to grow low amounts of THC, but it's nature. So there could be an issue with that. And that's a risk for people. And that's also a risk for financial institutions because, they're talking about with these banking bills, we had a lot of progress with the MORE Act and the States Act, but unfortunately what happened is it's now kind of stuck where the person who's in charge of kind of setting the bill for hearing is kind of interested in imposing a THC cap. And if there's more than 2% THC, then that wouldn't necessarily allow access to banking.
Yeah.
Now that's a pretty unreasonable cap, 2% THC. No medical marijuana dispensary or company operates at a 2% THC. That would be essentially a hemp banking bill, which is unneeded because hemp's legal. So it's not even really helpful at all, one would think. Plus, it's risky because, again, you don't know it's the percentage of THC until you're at the finish line. So, you spent a whole harvest cultivating a full field of plant, and then all of a sudden it's garbage when you're ready to harvest. You don't know until then. So there's no way to get a real preview of what the outcome's going to be. So that's just a crazy way to live and to operate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge risk for farmers who, again, it's not a stable business as it is, and there's so many other outside factors that can affect your crop. So you make it through the harvest, you make it all the way there, you're excited, and then keep the cork on the champagne because you got to get rid of it and start over.
Yeah, and then of course I'm sure you've heard. Then sometimes you get these eager beaver law enforcement agencies or
yes.
private carriers that. We had one that we heard of that was going through New York, and they were shipping hemp, and they shipped it through FedEx. And apparently, there's a term in the FedEx carriage contract that says you're not supposed to be shipping hemp. Period. I assume the shipper didn't know this, or I'm not sure. But whatever it was, is FedEx called the authorities and said, "Hey, we think we have marijuana here." Because they thought it was marijuana. It looks like marijuana. It smells like marijuana. At first, law enforcement wasn't interested, but they were very persistent. They called again, and they kept calling. Finally, someone in New York seized this massive truckload full of hemp. Mm-hmm. All of it had the proper certificates of testing showing that it was below the limit, that it was actually hemp, that it wasn't marijuana. They didn't care anyway. They took everything. And then, they arrested the truck driver. Weeks later, it ends up that they decided to release it all. Actually, I'm sorry, this one wasn't a truck driver. It was a shipment. So weeks later, they ended up releasing the shipment, but it's too late at that point.
Yeah.
The person had already been arrested, put in jail, had court hearings, had to hire an attorney, and that's for their own liberty. They had to do the same to get the product out, but the product is perishable. It's a horrible, horrible situation when you can, you sell your harvest, you try to ship it, you do everything right, you put all your certificates in the shipment. So if anyone opens it, it says, "Hey, listen, I'm legal."
Yeah.
And then some eager beaver just says, "No, I don't think so. We don't believe you. We're just going to seize it, at the peril of you going to prison." And it's just really unfair.
No, and to your point, I think education is the biggest thing that the entire country needs on this planet. So there is a lot of legislature that is trying to help medical marijuana in general, but realistically, research can't be done, I don't believe, and I could be wrong, until it's descheduled. Is there anything in the current legislation that says that although it is Schedule 1, that the states can make their own decision to allow proper facilities to do research, or does it have to be descheduled at the federal level first? I think there's was it the University of Mississippi or Missouri has a license? Mississippi who doesn't.
Right. Well, see, the problem is that the research isn't necessarily the problem. People can do the research. It's where they want to do the research and if they want any funding. A lot of research is done at federally funded institutions, and it's done with federal funds. So not having federal funds and not being able to do it at a federally funded institution is disqualifying, basically. You can't get anything done.
Got it.
So states can do all the research they want if you could find a state that's willing to bankroll a study and a location where it can be done properly, that's not subject to federal funds.
So realistically, we're waiting till it's descheduled when it's.
People say Schedule 2, Schedule 3, but I agree that descheduling is really the only way. It's almost as if changing the scheduling to 2 or 3 or even 4 would almost make it worse, because it's not going to make. It certainly won't make any of the state businesses legal. Those folks are still. None of that stuff fits under any of those schedules. It can't. So it doesn't help. Yeah. It's just a matter of really, why is the federal government involved? We have mostly the state regulation is the enforcement arm anyway. It's the state police power that's doing the grow house bust and the cannabis bust. The feds aren't doing that. That's not something that's typically on their radar, because they're more focused on criminal enterprises that are moving cocaine and heroin and other substances internationally.
Yeah.
It's more of just a vestige of the past that it's even controlled federally, because it's just not a matter of strict federal control. It really is a local matter. So descheduling is so important, because if we remove those restrictions, the sky doesn't fall. You still have this very strong state-based regulatory body. Of every state has made their own choice, and a lot of them have kept strong criminal penalties, and that's their prerogative. So those wouldn't go away. There'd still be that ability for each state to decide what they want to do. It's just there wouldn't be this overarching constraint that's kind of just looming in the background that really only, all it does is kind of interfere with people. It doesn't necessarily protect the public, because it's just, cannabis isn't something that they're necessarily focusing on anyway.
Understood. So we are Super Bowl weekend in Miami, so we're going to wrap this up shortly, but there's one more thing I want to cover with you, and this is something I've always been very interested in, is the future of cannabis, right? So everything goes the way that we all want it to go. It becomes federally legal. How do you think at that point the states are going to fight to keep up the walls between states? Because you have places like Massachusetts and Illinois that have gone out on a limb and made it legal, and I'm sure they don't want the Florida and California marijuana coming and flooding into their state and putting their own cannabis businesses out of business. I mean, if you think about it, it is a crop. There are climates in which it grows better than others. I believe it's more tropical climates, and again, I'm probably wrong about half the things I say, but California, Humboldt is a place where it grows well. In Florida, and I know you can kind of control that indoor, but it's still a plant, and there's still geography, and there's still resources. I'm sure this is your opinion because it's very far out there, but do you think the states are going to fight to keep the interstate commerce away, to kind of disrupt that free market to protect the cannabis companies within their own states? Or will it be medical stays within the state and rec can go wherever it wants? What do you think that's going to look like? And that's going to probably be like Cannabis 9.0,
I'm thinking for medical, let's just talk about recreational at least to start. So The only place where I've actually seen some of what you're talking about, which is very innovative, is California. And unfortunately, a lot of their other stuff is not working out all that well, but they do have some very innovative provisions in there. And they're trying to establish essentially like the ability to create like a Napa Valley for cannabis, so they could have a special designation. They could establish special designations that they will be only people who meet the criteria will be able to say, hey, this is Napa Valley grown cannabis or Humboldt grown cannabis. So that is something where, if the states are willing to embrace their own products, that is something that the states I think will definitely compete on, because there is, wine can come from a lot of different states, but like, Napa Valley is still one of the most famous. That's just a lot more famous than Alabama wine.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's fresh from Florida. People are going to be drawn to the Sunshine State. There's definitely an opportunity. We're very famous with oranges. I'm sure there's a branding opportunity there for a Sunshine State sort of thing. I think that in terms of each state is going to likely try to gravitate towards what they can in terms of what their geography is. Some states like Massachusetts, I'm not really sure that they have anything besides an indoor ability. They got some nice buildings to grow inside. I'm not really sure that their outdoor grows are all that great. I just don't know with the temperature wise, but I think that states will, like a Florida and like a California, will try to distinguish themselves, grown in the sun, grown by hand. People are going to try to create more of a craft brand, I think, there's always going to be a Budweiser, there's always going to be a Miller. There's going to be a Corona, but there's also going to be a Samuel Adams, and there's going to be other brands where, it's a unique perspective. Like the Sam Adams has got the Boston Lager, it's like got that unique sort of, you think of like the Revolutionary War and whatnot. I could see that happening with cannabis. And the only state that I'm aware of right now that has anything in their law to kind of foster that sort of thing is California. Okay. And I think, though, we're likely to see that in other states. California's law is huge. Most of the other states are much slimmer in terms of law and regulation. So it's just a matter of building out the law and regulation and having more of an opportunity actually even to participate to even get to that point. But I do think that we're likely to see states encouraging their own businesses and inspiring their own, almost like tourism. Yeah. I think we're also likely to see cannabis tourism. I think some states are already competing on those levels. Yeah. They don't all admit it. But, states such as Colorado have taken notice that obviously their tourism numbers have gone up. They haven't, I don't believe, officially agreed to concede that it has anything to do with cannabis. Yeah. And they think it's a coincidence. But, they have noticed that there have been trends. In the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, I know there's a competition there, basically who can be legal first, because that is such a cluster there. So it's going to be unique. There's different pockets of the country where I think, based on how they are traditionally, you're going to see some unique aspects of how they develop because, it's going to be hard for New Jersey to legalize without New York and vice versa, or one to stay legal and one to not. It's just too close. It's just like, it's almost like it is one state, but it's, different groups of people.
For them, it's, am I buying it near my house or am I buying it near the office, in my opinion, right? So whoever legalizes first makes you realize, am I buying it by my house in New Jersey or am I buying it by my office in Manhattan? So
and they lose out. Because here in Florida we have no taxes, but in most other states, we're talking about 25% typically of taxes. So why go through the Lincoln Tunnel to get cannabis when you can just get it in New Jersey? It doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Well, like I said, we are the Friday before the Super Bowl. We are in Miami, so we need to get out of here and go home. Ari, I really appreciate your time, but because this is a Super Bowl episode and this is going to air after the Super Bowl, I'm going to make you pick Chiefs or 49ers.
49ers.
All right. We'll see if you're right.
We'll see.
You guys will know instantly if he's right. Ari, really appreciate the time.
Anytime.
I'm sure there's going to be more Ackerman people on this podcast. Really looking forward to the partnership with you guys, and thank you again.
Anytime.
And come see Ari at any of the Cannabis Lab events, the Dade County ones, and then our conference at the end of the year. Hope you guys enjoyed the Super Bowl party. I'm saying that before that, but this will air after it. Check it out, joinclab.com. Everybody have a great night.
Have a great weekend.
Cool.